In this chapter, we're going to explore a really critical but often overlooked skill in the world of open source projects: communication. It's a world that's obviously built on code, but as we're about to see, it's really held together by the written word. We're going to dive into how you can make your contributions truly count, not just with your technical chops, but through the way you write. Now, this quote might seem a little surprising, maybe even random, but it perfectly captures the heart of our entire discussion today. Think about it. In open source, collaborators are often spread all over the world, across different continents and time zones. The only thing they really know about you comes from what you write. Your words become your identity, they're your handshake, and they build your reputation. We'll come back to the amazing story behind this quote in just a little bit.
So, here's how we're going to break this down. We've structured this as a kind of guide, taking you from the foundational why all the way to some pretty advanced strategies. We'll kick things off with why your writing is so important. Then we'll get into the mechanics of making a great impression. After that, we'll tackle the tricky parts of group discussions, how to manage communication as a project gets bigger, and finally, how to handle really sensitive situations, like security disclosures.
So, let's start with the big idea. In open source, you are what you write. Now, that might sound a little dramatic, but it's true. Over the long haul, your ability to communicate clearly can actually be even more important than your raw programming talent, especially when it comes to influencing a project's direction. This slide really puts it into perspective, doesn't it? Imagine a brilliant coder, just a genius, but they can't really explain their ideas or get people on board. They might solve one incredibly complex problem, but that's kind of where their contribution ends. On the flip side, you could have someone with more modest programming skills, but who is an excellent communicator. That person can coordinate whole teams, build consensus around an idea, and have a massive impact on the project's success. Their influence scales in a way the lone geniuses just can't. And this brings us right back to that incredible story from the beginning. So back in 1993, a guy named Jim Blandy at the Free Software Foundation was working with a contributor on GNU Emacs. This person's bug reports were just crystal clear, and their code fixes were almost always perfect. So the FSF sent over the standard copyright assignment forms, and the contributor replied, "I don't have an employer." After a little more back and forth, he revealed he was just 13 years old. Nobody had a clue because his writing was so professional and so lucid. He didn't write like a teenager. He wrote like a top-notch developer. And in that world, that's all that mattered. That story is just a perfect setup for our next section. So now that we know why this is so important, let's get into the practical side of things. In this next part, we'll cover the specific, hands-on techniques you can use to make sure your writing gives the best possible impression and makes your contributions as effective as they can be. Okay, these might seem like really minor details, but trust me, they are the bedrock of good communication hygiene in open source. Sending plain text makes sure your message is readable by everyone on any device, and it archives perfectly. Keeping your lines under 80 characters might seem old school, but it's a sign of respect for people who read their email in a standard terminal. And quoting intelligently, where you trim the original message and respond point by point, makes conversations so much easier to follow. Following these conventions, it's like speaking the local language. It shows you get the culture. Beyond the formatting, of course, the content itself is key. And the most important thing here is to always think about your audience. In any successful project, there's a really high reader-to-writer ratio. For every single person who posts, hundreds, maybe even thousands of people might read it. So if you spend an extra 2 minutes finding a URL or summarizing a long discussion, you're not just saving one person time. You're saving the entire project hundreds of minutes of collective time. It's a huge efficiency game. And of course, editing your messages before you hit send, it prevents confusion and shows you respect your reader's attention. Tone can be really tricky to get right online. What might feel a little brusque in a normal social setting is often totally standard in technical forums. A direct question or unpadded technical criticism usually isn't seen as rude. In fact, it can be a sign of respect. It implies your work is worth a serious, focused look. What is considered rude is being lazy. If you're going to offer criticism, make it detailed and thoughtful. If you just don't have time to do a thorough analysis, it's better to just say so. A low-effort, dismissive response just implies that the topic and the people discussing it aren't worth your time. To build a solid reputation, you need a consistent identity, which you can think of as your online face. It's a good idea to use the same screen name across different platforms, ideally a simple version of your real name. You'll want to avoid grandiose handles like Wonderhacker. They don't really impress anyone and can make it seem like you're more focused on your image than on the substance of your work. And also be mindful of your email signature. A huge legal disclaimer tacked onto every single post can send the wrong signal.
It's better to just keep it simple and professional. Okay, so we've covered individual communication. Now let's zoom out and look at the dynamics of group discussions. These conversations are the lifeblood of a project, but they can get derailed so easily. We're going to explore some common pitfalls, or anti-patterns, and talk about how to steer conversations back onto a productive path. And this brings us to one of the most famous pitfalls of all, the bikeshed effect. A computer scientist named Paul Henning-Kamp observed that a board of directors will approve a multi-million-dollar nuclear power plant with very little discussion because it's just too complex for most people to really grasp. But when the agenda turns to designing a simple bike shed for employees, everyone has an opinion on the color, the materials, the roof, and the debate can go on forever. Just being able to recognize when you're in a bike shed painting discussion is the first step to getting out of it.
Now, similar to bike shedding, but often way more intense, are holy wars. These are those passionate, entrenched debates where nobody is willing to budge because they believe they are fundamentally right. You've seen them. Tabs versus spaces, or which programming language is the best. The key difference here is that the issue often can't be resolved on purely technical grounds. These arguments almost never lead to a good outcome, and they can be incredibly damaging to the project's morale.
So what do you do when a discussion starts to spiral out of control? The key is to guide, not to command. Instead of just saying, "This is going nowhere," which can sound accusatory, you can dispassionately observe the state of the conversation. Use inclusive language, like "we," to show that you're all in this together. And then, most importantly, provide a clear, positive path forward. Suggesting that the next post on the topic should contain a concrete proposal or even a working patch, well, that raises the bar for participation and encourages the people who are serious to take the next constructive step.
You also have to be aware of the noisy minority effect. A few very vocal people can absolutely flood a mailing list, which creates this illusion of widespread controversy, when in reality, most people might actually agree with the proposal, or they might just be silent. If you think this is happening, you can counter it by gently pointing out the actual numbers. Something simple like, "I've seen posts from 3 people who disagree, but I know Alice, Bob, and Carol have all expressed support," can really help recalibrate the group's perspective of where the consensus actually is.
Now that we know how to handle some of those difficult discussions, let's talk about a different kind of challenge, the kind that comes with success. As a project grows, the sheer volume of communication can become totally overwhelming. In this section, we'll look at strategies for managing that growth and making sure the project's collective knowledge is preserved and easy to find.
The communication channels in a growing project have a pretty natural evolution. Most of them start with just a single mailing list for absolutely everything. But as the traffic increases, you'll start to see distinct conversations emerge, some for users, some for developers. That's the signal to create dedicated forums for these topics. This is usually followed by a period of, well, gentle nagging, where the veterans of the project kindly remind people to post to the right place. And eventually, this new structure just becomes second nature to the whole community.
We touched on this earlier, but it is the central principle of scalable communication. That high reader-to-writer ratio is exactly why you should make very conspicuous use of the archives. When someone asks a question, don't just answer it from memory. Take the extra minute to find the answer in the mailing list archives and provide a direct link. This does 2 amazing things at once. It answers the immediate question, and it teaches everyone who's watching that the archives are a valuable, searchable resource. It's the old "teach a person to fish" proverb in action. As a project gets older, it develops this huge body of unwritten rules and traditions. To help new people feel welcome and get up to speed quickly, you have to make these traditions explicit. If you see new contributors making the same mistake over and over again, that's a clear sign that a guideline needs to be documented. And don't be afraid to make that documentation highly visible. The Subversion project, for example, dramatically reduced the number of bogus bug reports just by putting their guidelines in huge, bold red letters on a bright yellow background. It's not pretty, but it's effective. In our final section, we're going to cover 2 specialized but absolutely critical topics. First, how to make sure conversations are happening in the right place, and second, the very specific, non-public process for handling one of the most sensitive issues any project can face, a security vulnerability. It's always a good habit to ask yourself, is this conversation happening in the right place? A discussion about one specific bug belongs in the bug tracker. A quick, informal chat is perfect for a real-time channel like IRC. But if that bug discussion starts to broaden into a major debate about design philosophy, it really needs to move to the main development mailing list. This makes sure that everyone who has a stake in that bigger decision actually sees the conversation and has a chance to participate. And it's really everyone's job to help guide these discussions to the right forum.
Okay, so handling security vulnerabilities is the one big exception, where the open source rule of total transparency is set aside, and for a very good reason. The whole process has to be confidential to protect users. It starts with a private, secure channel for receiving reports. Then, a small, trusted group of developers works quietly on a fix, usually in a private code repository. They'll evaluate how severe it is, often using a standard called the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, or CVSS, and get a unique ID called a CVE number. Then, just before the public announcement, they might privately pre-notify some high-impact sites to give them a head start on patching. And finally, the vulnerability and the fix are announced to the public at the exact same time. This ensures that when the problem becomes widely known, the solution is already available.
So, if there's one single thing to take away from our entire discussion, it's this. Effective communication in an open-source project doesn't just happen by accident. It is a deliberate skill. It requires conscious effort, practice, and real attention to detail. From the way you format your emails to how you guide a difficult conversation, every single interaction you have shapes your reputation and your ability to contribute effectively.
And that brings us to our final thought. As you think about getting more involved in open source, or really even just improving how you interact in any online collaborative space, I want to leave you with a question. What is the first change you'll make to how you write? Will you start editing your messages a little more carefully? Will you be more mindful of using archives? Just reflecting on that is the first step toward building a really strong, effective digital impression.